I'm Dermot Hodson.
I'm John Peterson. Together, we edit the institutions of the European Union.
We're here in Brussels in the heart of the EU quarter. Here are 10 things that we think you should know about EU institutions. Number 1. The EU cannot be understood without its institutions. The popular image of the European Union is as some vast institution that has taken power away from the member states. However, this image is misleading. The EU is better understood as a collection of institutions, intergovernmental, supranational and transnational, that battle it out over EU policy. Together, these institutions make up what is arguably the most ambitious and powerful international organisation ever created.
Number 2, the EU is the most ambitious attempt ever to build supranational institutions. Supranational means the general, combined, collective European interests. The European Commission is a powerful supranational institution. It plays a pivotal role in EU policy making by proposing all EU policy and legislation in most cases. Here we are inside the Parlement, the headquarters of the European Commission. This is where the College of Commissioners meets and where the commissioners and their advisors have their offices. It's open all hours and it's very much the nerve center of the EU's institutions.
Scholars have sought to understand the European Commission from a variety of theoretical perspectives. One of the first academics to look systematically at the European Commission was Ernst Haas. His neo-functionalist approach to the study of European integration saw the Commission as a new centre of power. He argued that economic interest groups like trade unions would shift their attention away from national capitals to the Commission. He expected the Commission also to lead integration. He expected the Commission to break the deadlock between member states through initiatives that would conveniently empower the Commission. He called this process upgrading the common interest. Stanley Hoffmann, the great pioneer of intergovernmentalism, argued that Haas had exaggerated the power of bodies such as the European Commission compared to the combined weight of member states. Scholars continue to study the European Commission, to think about it in different ways. The study of the European Union matters for wider debates about politics and international relations.
Number 3, national governments try to maintain a tight grip on the EU through intergovernmental institutions. Some argue that the EU is very tightly controlled by intergovernmental institutions made up of representatives of national governments. The Council of Ministers brings together ministers from EU member states to decide on whether a Commission proposal should become law. When an EU regulation is adopted on, for example, bankers' bonuses, it originates as a Commission proposal but cannot become EU law without the backing of the Council. The Council's capacity for consensus building makes it an extraordinarily efficient institution, but it's also one that faces criticism for its secrecy and lack of transparency.
Number 4, the EU is a remarkable experiment in transnational politics. Transnational institutions derive their authority from sources other than national governments. In the case of the European Parliament, the peoples of Europe. The European Parliament began life as the Common Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community. It later changed its name to the European Parliament, and in 1979, MEPs were directly elected for the first time. A major problem for the European Parliament is that it is invisible to many of its citizens, who turn out in low numbers to vote for it. In 2014, less than 15% of people in Slovakia voted for their MEPs. Nonetheless, the European Parliament plays a major role in EU policymaking. Today, it is a co-legislator alongside the Council of Ministers. This means when the Commission proposes a law, for example a regulation on bankers' bonuses, it must be adopted by both the Council and the European Parliament. Number 5. The European Council has become the locus of power in the European Union. A powerful intergovernmental organisation, the European Council brings together the heads of state or government of the member states. It has become the institution of last resort for the Union, dealing with its all too frequent crises. In July 2015, the heads of state or government met here in Brussels to deal with Greece's worsening debt crisis. An agreement was eventually reached after a long night of talks, but the EU was heavily criticised for riding roughshod over Greek democracy. Number 6. The headcount of EU institutions has increased dramatically since the 1990s. At its launch in 1952, the European Coal and Steel Community had 5 institutions. By 2016, there were 70 EU institutions. A big puzzle for students of the European Union is why member states are so willing to cooperate but so reluctant to empower the European Commission along traditional lines. Part of the explanation may lie in the design of these institutions. Many of the new bodies created by the European Union, especially since the 1990s, are intergovernmental in design. They allow member states to cooperate while keeping a tight grip over the functioning of these bodies. Number 7. The size of EU institutions has increased dramatically. The high authority of the European Coal and Steel Community had just 500 staff in total. By our estimates, the total number of staff working for the EU institutions had grown to 54,000. This is large by the standards of an international organisation, but small compared to national governments. There are around 14 million public servants working for the EU member states.
Number 8, EU institutions are in a perpetual state of reform. To the outside world, EU institutions may seem like glacial bureaucracies that are incapable of reform, but the reality is quite different. Maybe the most radical change over recent years is the so-called Spitzenkandidaten system. The 2007 Lisbon Treaty required the European Council to take into account the most recent European Parliament elections when appointing a Commission President. Controversially, European political groups in the Parliament used the provision to put forward their own nominees for Commission President before the 2014 EP election. When the European People's Party emerged as the largest party, it insisted that its nominee, the former Luxembourg Prime Minister Jean-Claude Juncker, be chosen as Commission President. That move allowed Juncker to claim a democratic mandate that his predecessors had lacked, although it is doubtful that the European Council would have chosen him on his own merits.
Number 9. EU institutions are in crises. In the 2000s, the Convention on the Future of Europe met here in the European Parliament building in Brussels to draw up the European Constitution. This was a bold and daring experiment designed to bring Europe closer to its citizens. It was an incredible experiment in participatory democracy that failed spectacularly when voters in France and the Netherlands rejected the treaty. Since then, the European Union has gone from one crisis to another, from the global financial crisis to the euro crisis to the European migration crisis to the UK's extraordinary decision in 2016 to vote in a referendum to leave the European Union. We're very used to the idea that EU institutions can muddle through crises, and they often do, but they have rarely faced so many crises at once, and it's now legitimate to ask whether EU institutions, having endured for so long, can endure much more.
Number 10, EU institutions matter. In the 1950s, institutions were created in Europe that still exist today: the European Commission, the Parliament, the Council of Ministers. They now coexist alongside newer, more specialized institutions such as the European Central Bank, or the European External Action Service, or the European Border Agency Frontex. EU institutions are shaping Europe's response to a range of challenges, including the euro crisis, the migration crisis, and conflicts in Syria and Ukraine. Whether the EU should wield such powers is a matter of fierce dispute, but there's no question EU institutions matter in debates about who governs Europe and how Europe shapes the world.